Okay, welcome everybody to the last session today. This is on the firms. My name is Kristina and I will be presenting joint work with Walter Bartosz, Michael Kaiser, Tim Opus and Brandon Shanks on the effects of an entrepreneurship training on startup enterprises. And this is a setting where we have entrepreneurship academies for university students in Uganda. And so entrepreneurship is usually seen as key for like kind of growth and development, and you would in particular think about this kind of Schumpeterian entrepreneurship that creates growth and also employment. And if you look at how many people in low-income countries are actually like kind of self-employed, it's the vast majority. So estimates from the International Labour Organization suggest that around 80% of the population is self-employed. But then these businesses are usually not really related to what you consider as a Schumpeterian enterprise. No? So it's like kind of one man or one woman businesses, very small. And many of them fail to grow sustainably and also to create employment. And in the setting of our study, Uganda, the picture looks very similar. So it's a very young society. There are very few formal sector jobs, also for those with high education. And then entrepreneurship is kind of the viable, but also sometimes desirable alternative to these lacking kind of formal sector employments. Okay. And no surprise, like kind of the literature of entrepreneurship training evaluation has been growing, because if entrepreneurship is so important, you would think of, if we can just teach it, then we should create sustainable growth and also kind of, employment development. But if you look at the vast literature on classical entrepreneurship training, the effects are not that strong, in particular kind of for traditional entrepreneurship trainings that focus on existing. You do have a couple of studies that look at effects for more nascent entrepreneurs, so is that similar to our setting, where you look at people who want to start up their business and their effects are a bit more moderate, or if you look into other type of businesses, business trainings that also focus like kind of personal initiatives and soft skills, then effects seem to be a bit larger, at least in terms of firm performance, but then also more recent studies show that these effects are rather short-lived. Okay, and another interesting aspect is that if we look at entrepreneurship in high-income countries, entrepreneurs seem to be positively selected on several characteristics. So in the US, they seem to be positively selected on like kind of human capital, at least those that go into kind of high-growth entrepreneurship versus entrepreneurship out of necessity. And then there are other studies that find that many cognitive and non-cognitive personality traits are related at least to success of enterprises, okay? And then there are also studies that look into the motives of becoming an entrepreneur and how these are related to success. So having all these kind of more correlational exercises that look at that there are certain characteristics that are positively related to entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial success, you may wonder how much a successful business growth is determined by a selection into entrepreneurship, or whether it's actually something that you can learn. And this is very important if we think about entrepreneurship trainings. How much should we focus on selection versus actually teaching certain skills? And in light of all these kind of settings, many different questions about. So for example, if you were to focus on a group that has been shown to be positively selected into entrepreneurship, at least in high-income countries, would that create more lasting effects on business performance? So, for example, as we do, if you focus on high-skilled young entrepreneurs, do you see better, like larger effects on firm performance and firm creation? Okay, and then if you think about that personality traits are positively influencing entrepreneurial success, is it that people select based on these, or is entrepreneurial activity shaping these kind of personality traits? So again, is it a selection, or is it kind of shaped by being an entrepreneur? And lastly, you would want to understand how kind of heterogeneous effects are, in particular if you think about like kind of if motives matter for becoming an entrepreneur, do we see different effects for different motives of selecting into entrepreneurship? Okay, and in this study we seek to answer all of these three big questions. So the first one, who selects into entrepreneurship? The second one, what are the motives that encourage nascent entrepreneurs to apply, to be honest? So we take this motive to apply for an entrepreneurship training as a proxy, as for a motive to want to be an entrepreneur, but essentially we're measuring the motive to apply for a training. And then lastly, if an entrepreneurship training that fosters or targets high skills young people to start their business, does that help to create this kind of high growth potential enterprise? Okay, and we do answer these questions based on the field experiment. So we have an entrepreneurship training that's action-based, where students learn to develop their kind of entrepreneurial mindset, and also where they develop an innovative business idea. And it's very practically oriented with a lot of exercises. And the idea is that at the end they all create their own startup, and there's a pitch event where they can also get some funding. So we only look at this training activities here. And we had planned it for 3 cohorts with 10 universities per semester. So a semester is essentially a cohort. COVID changed our plans a little bit, so we only have 2 cohorts now, and 2 more are in the field at the moment. And so I will be presenting the work of the preliminary results only based on half of them, the sample, or 2/3 of the sample. And what we also do is that we document selection into the training along different steps. In addition to having exogenous variation on the admission into entrepreneurship and exogenous variation into the kind of motives that people are exposed to before applying to the Entrepreneurship Academy. And here we focus on 2 different motives. The first one is, the first type of message is stressing the profit that you can make. So do you want to become an entrepreneur to make money? And the second one, we call it creative freedom. And this stresses a bit more the independence of being your own boss and the flexibility and the possibility to follow your creative ideas. Okay, so what do we find? When we look at who selects into entrepreneurship training, then we see that training is essentially a substitute for entrepreneurial knowledge or network. So those that have less knowledge and less network are more likely to apply, and those who already have these are less likely to apply for that training. When looking at what motivates nascent entrepreneurs to apply, we see that this creative freedom theme creates more applications. And there's also some selection patterns. So those who are attracted by this creative freedom are more cognitively able, and then they are also less overconfident when they apply for the training. And when we look at the third question, so what are our effects of this training on business creation and business success? We do see at least like kind of 9 months after the training an increase of the incidence of owning a business by 21%. Some very, very moderate but not very statistically significant effects on firm success, but this may be because it's a short time frame. And we see that these are potentially facilitated to kind of by instilling certain entrepreneurial attitudes. And we see also that those who enter the training based on the profit motive, so who were attracted by making money, are performing better in the end. Okay, so we contribute to 4 strands of the literature of this research. So the first one is this large literature on business training, so entrepreneurship trainings, and very few here focus on nascent entrepreneurs. As I already said, we have this kind of positive selection education that's been shown for US entrepreneurs, and our contribution is here to bring essentially these aspects together. So we have a sample that focuses on highly skilled youth, and the only other paper that does is Clermont and all, but in contrast to them, we have an extracurricular program and not something that's integrated into their curriculum. Then we contribute to this literature on the entrepreneurial mindset training, so this training more focused on soft skills and this entrepreneurial mindset, and here we add essentially further evidence to this non-traditional training that has been shown to create short-term effects that fade away over time. When we look at selection into entrepreneurship, that's mainly based on high-income countries, but we see that entrepreneurs are positively selected on human capital and cognitive and non-cognitive personality traits. And our contribution here is twofold. So first of all, we document selection based on different personality traits, preferences, and beliefs into the training. And then also we assess the impact of attending the training on these traits, preferences, and beliefs. And lastly, we contribute to the literature on motivation of becoming an entrepreneur. So there are some qualitative evidence or observational studies that would suggest that these non-pecuniary benefits are attracting more people into entrepreneurship. That has been confirmed in studies that look at a similar setup with their kind of different marketing themes in the US and in the UK. And we essentially look at a similar question in a low-income country setting. Okay, since we have some time, if there are questions along the way, I'm happy to take them along the way. I may not see you because of the light, but interrupt me in case you have questions. Okay? So, let me show you our research design. So essentially we start off by a big marketing campaign, and the universe of students were exposed to this marketing campaign, and then there's a self-selection into attending an information session where much more information is provided, or people are not interested in entrepreneurship training at all. So they are kind of not attending this information session. And then at the information session, they essentially decide whether they want to apply for the academy or not, and once they apply, they are either admitted or not. And so we have two ways in which we have exogenous variation. And the first one is at the information session, we display these two different motives. One's the profit theme, and on the other hand, this kind of creative freedom theme. And so we can look at this selection based on the decision to apply based on the motive that you saw. And then we essentially use an oversubscription design between all who applies and randomly allocate whether they are admitted to the training or not. Okay. So now if I link this design to the 3 research questions that we are set out to answer, I start with the last one. So essentially we use this kind of last stage here to answer what's the effect of the entrepreneurship training, and we have follow-up service of up to 3 years. Now I will only present you, as you will see later on, only the midline results 9 months after.
Kristina?
Yeah.
Do they know in advance if they're going to be randomly selected?
Yeah. So we tell them that, like, kind of, so I mean, we can't really fully disclose it because we also want them to kind of put energy into the application. Otherwise there would be too many dropouts. So we disclose it, but like in a very indiscreet. Yeah?
So you gave them a score on the application and then you selected from these numbers?
No, it's really random. There's no score.
Okay. And then, sorry, on the, sorry, I forgot my question.
Our students we do the same major with this major, but from university, what's the major, what's the and other options.
So yeah, we look at that. So essentially, we stratify the random assignment first of all based on the university, but then we also give priority to those who are like kind of at the end of their studies, so it's usually undergraduates, and we try to fill up all the slots first. Like we stratify based on the year of study. And then, so that those who are close to finish their studies are more likely, or like, that we have a larger share both in the treatment controls and along those, and only then stratify them on the second level. And we also look at like kind of field of study. So we have essentially business and non-business students, and we haven't looked into heterogeneous effects, but that was certainly something that we'll do in the future, because you think that like kind of for non-business students this is much more complementing to what they're doing, whereas for business students that's much more substitute.
Sorry, was it a pay? Did they have to pay something for attending, or were there work?
Yes, they have to pay like kind of a commitment fee, but it's kind of quite small, and it's reimbursed in the end. So it's just like kind of for making them not, once they are selected, to kind of actually show up. Okay, so then the second question on the kind of motive we answer with this group here, or the subsection where we have these kind of two marketing themes. And essentially now we study what motives are attracting people into entrepreneurship training. And then lastly we have this endogenous selection, and here we don't have that's a descriptive or a correlational exercise that we're doing, but still very interesting because this is very little understood. And what we are doing here is that we essentially compare those who were exposed to the marketing campaign, so we document which classes were exposed to the marketing campaign, so which classes our enumerators went, and who choose not to attend, and then we compare them to those who essentially apply after attending the information session, and we also follow these guys for several rounds to track how they would do without the training otherwise. Okay. Good, so what do we have? So we have implemented 2 ways, fall 2019 and spring 2020, then COVID hit, and we had to pause. Uganda closed all the universities for 2 years. It was the longest lockdown in education in the world. So now we have started to implement a 3rd wave in the fall, and now we're implementing a 4th wave because we had to reduce the number of universities that we could target. It should not matter too much because we will have cohort fixed effects, and everything is specified as the cohorts of the relationship goes through. But it just delays everything. And we have baseline data that I'll show you now, and also then midline data, so 9 months after the training, what are the kind of short-term effects. Okay. So let's look at endogenous self-selection. So first of all, we don't find differences in business and financial outcomes. So whether they have started a business, if they have started work by profit and so forth, between those guys who apply for the training and those guys who don't apply to the training. But we see that those students that are not interested tend to have larger business networks. 5 minutes? So they are more likely to have at least one source of information to ask for business advice, and also conditional on it, they have more sources of information to ask for business advice. And you see that here, the dark gray is like kind of the non-interested students, and the light gray is the interested students. And so essentially we take that as suggestive evidence that the training is perceived as a substitute for other sources of entrepreneurial knowledge and network. Okay, and further we see that the non-interested students score better on a lot of traits that are associated with successful entrepreneurs. So they have higher levels of grit, they have higher tolerance for losses, and then they're also more likely to overestimate their own cognitive ability. So here we have Raven matrices and ask them how many they solved correctly, and they tend to be a bit too over-optimistic on these things. And they also feel much more confident with regard to facing entrepreneurial challenges. And so the applicants expect that they benefit from the training, so we ask that, and they are also more confident about their future abilities, so they really seem to see a benefit of attending the training. And taking this together, we interpret that. And the applicants are falling short on like kind of characteristics that are associated with successful entrepreneurship, and they are eager to change it because they apply for the training and they are aware of these kind of shortcomings. Okay, so when we look at the marketing motives, this is already said, we essentially vary these motives before the application, and this allows us to understand, first of all, which marketing theme is more attractive. It allows us to look at sorting patterns into application to entrepreneurship, and then we can also look at what are implications for training success. And we find that we have a higher rate of application with the creative freedom, and then we have this positive selection that I'll show in a minute. So here these are logic regressions, and you see that students who are randomly allocated to see the profit theme in the information session are around 5 percentage points or 7%. Less likely to apply when they saw the financial profit theme. So the creative freedom is more attracting students to become an entrepreneur, or at least to apply for our entrepreneurship training. And when we look at their characteristics, then also more cognitive able students are applying under the creative freedom theme, and less overconfident students. And we see that these marketing themes do influence like kind of stated motives and also expected profits of the applicants. Okay, so then we look at the impact evaluation of the training, and we have here, first of all, we offer admission to the training. So it's an ITT effect that we are estimating, and we are comparing those who were offered admission to those that were denied admission. And we look at a set of different outcomes, so in order to kind of reduce the number of hypotheses that we test, we aggregate them into indices, and essentially we have different primary economic outcomes, and then we also look at like kind of channels on personal and on the personal level, on the business level, to try to dig a bit into mechanisms. So here we look at business creation, business success, capital and labor input, and economic self-sufficiency, and then we have a set of like kind of business practices, entrepreneurial traits, and so forth that we're looking at. So when we look at business creation, this is an index composed of the likelihood to own a business and the hours invested into a business. Then we see that our training, being admitted to the training, has a positive effect. If we split that up into the likelihood to the both components that go into, they are 21% more likely to own a business if they went through the training, and they also are a bit more invested into their business in terms of weekly hours. And these results are robust to vincerization and inverse hyperbolic spline transformations. But we don't see very strong effects on like kind of business success, that would be sales and profits. We do see a little bit on capital and labor input, but these results are not as robust. 1 minute, good. Okay, so what are the underlying mechanisms? Where do we see effects? we see that the training is improving the share of business practices applied, and then it also improves some of these entrepreneurial attitudes. They are more competitive, they are more patient, they are more proactive, and this is not too surprising because these are things that are being addressed in the training. So it's a lot on this entrepreneurial mindset. So it's good that we see that it's also changing, so at least it's successful in this respect. And then also the network of admitted students expands in response to attending the training, or in the ITT effect, sorry. Then we only look here at heterogeneous effects based on the marketing theme that they are exposed to. And this is something where we haven't really went into detail, but we think that's very interesting, is that those who are less likely to apply, namely those who saw the profit theme, are the ones who benefit more from the training. So those, here you have now the business creation by marketing theme, and those who are admitted and saw the financial profit theme were less likely to apply, are more likely to actually create their own business, and we don't see any difference here for those who saw the creative freedom between the control and the treatment. Okay, so this is something we want to dig into further in the future, so if you have ideas here, we're happy to hear that. We still have endlines to implement, so the returns to your comments are extremely high at the moment, so it's all appreciated. Okay, so then let me wrap up in my allocated time. So endogenous selection into entrepreneurship training suggests that the training is perceived as a substitute for other entrepreneurial knowledge and networks. Non-pecuniary benefits seem to be more attractive to students to select into entrepreneurship. And we do have some differential selection patterns, namely under creative freedom, more cognitive able and less overconfident students to apply for the training. We have positive effects on business creation around 9 months after the training, and that seems to be facilitated by better practice of entrepreneurial attitudes and an expanded network, and it's effects that are driven by those who saw the financial profit. We don't have any indication for these high-growth businesses yet that we thought we would be creating, but then also we only have a 9-month time period, and it's maybe too short to actually see differences in sales and profits. And we hope that kind of our end line, it's a bit more than 20 months now afterwards because of the COVID break, that this will kind of show what are the long-term effects, and are we really creating, or is this training creating enterprises that are more likely to grow and that employ more people. Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Kristina. I really enjoyed reading the paper, and I look forward to the revisions that come with your longer-term results and more of the details and analysis that will follow. I'll skip summarizing the paper since most of you heard it already, and just move on to what I think some of the strengths of the paper are. Is the clicker here somewhere?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So the paper is obviously policy relevant, just given the amount of work that's happened around entrepreneurship, looking at this question around selection as well as skilling effects. It looks to identify sort of what motives are actually going to draw people into the entrepreneurship, and it has like experiments embedded within the study as well. So these are interesting results, especially on motivation. So I have a couple of questions and comments on the selection experiment as well as the training one. I think it would be useful to understand sort of what the cost information is, both, I don't mean just in terms of like costs, but also the opportunity costs itself, and maybe introducing selection into your program. And if the training is free, so you mentioned there was a deposit and so on, but if it's free, does it actually pass the sort of cost-benefit test? The other thing is we care about selection into entrepreneurship and not into the training, because I think the question you're trying to answer is selection into the entrepreneurship. So can you tell us sort of, who is starting the businesses? a number, whatever months for your midline and your end line after the training. And then I think it would be useful to understand if the population that was uninterested in the training, but also in the information session, because sort of 2 levels of filtering into the training are going to be more informed. So right now, I think we're only looking at it at 1 level, but I think the actual follow-up from the information session itself may be really interesting to actually look at if you're selecting likely entrepreneurs. The other thing is, it would be useful to know what the priors of these students are, especially as you compare creativity priming versus profits. So one possible hypothesis is that most people know entrepreneurship is good for profit, so the creative motive is more effective because my prior was already that profit is a way, like entrepreneurship is a way to make profits. So I'm getting more results from the creative motivation because my priors were different. So I think the idea of like if your prior is uninformative or not will help understand sort of the motivation effects better. Okay, it'd be great, I think, as you do more follow-up to understand sort of looking at the business creation and success further, sort of delving into the kinds of businesses they're doing, what sort of inputs are, business capital, access to capital, debt, sort of a whole range of other related ideas. And then I think trying to understand also what are the kinds of networks and network formation they're getting into. Is the network formation internal or external to the training program itself? And sort of, since you're saying, it's sort of helping bridge that gap, I think it would be helpful to understand sort of what that, are they meeting basically, co-entrepreneurs or investors or other sort of sources within their networks itself. And then I think it would be super interesting as you do more work to actually understand impact and ultimate outcomes. So thinking about income, assets, and so on. And then, of course, because I do gender equality work, it would be great to actually see, if you have that in the paper, but great to see sort of longer term effects, especially as you think about creative freedom, which is more flexibility and freedom in entrepreneurship and how that sort of works for men and women. So, all right, I think that's it.
So yeah, very valid points and very very helpful. So okay. And maybe I can just quickly go back to design, because some of the questions we will actually be able to address. And one thing that we started to do now, and this would maybe help a little bit, is also that we look at those who didn't apply, who saw the theme and who then didn't apply, and follow up on these guys. And all of the things that you asked for, what happened to those that didn't attend the information session, or those now who didn't choose to apply then later on, we should see, because there's also a lot of business creation in those who are not admitted, who were interested in entrepreneurship. And if these guys were also interested but didn't see like kind of the training as helpful, then we should also see similar developments there. So this is something that we will look into, but we are collecting the data. The gender differences, yeah, perfect. We will look into that as well. We also have a follow-up study where we look at access to finance related to the kind of gender differences. We will not have so much on ultimate outcomes because it's already quite a rich data collection that we're pursuing, so we will mainly look at like kind of business outcomes, but then of course it will be income related. And we also look at other labor market outcomes, so you could think of that if this entrepreneurship is just that kind of out of necessity because they don't find a formal sector job, we will also see later on if they have other employment possibilities, and then if their training helps to kind of improve the probability of getting a formal sector job. But yeah, thanks so much. Josh?
Do you have any overconfidence measures at end?
And what? At
end
end line.
Because you can imagine like you have the less overconfident guys select in, and then you treat them, and then they like bounce up to everyone else's overconfidence, and so they start businesses but then don't do a very good job.
So, I mean, the overconfidence measures are based on that they solved Raven matrices in the intro sessions, and then we ask them how many they think they got right. Yeah. And we don't have that at end line. We also have to move everything, now to phone service based on the pandemic, and now they spread over the whole country, so we keep to the phone surveys. And so I think we may have qualitative measures, but not incentivized.
I mean, you might be able to do it with like Don Moore's done this with like trivia quizzes that you can do over the phone pretty easily.
Okay.
You just like ask them a bunch of trivia questions and ask how many of them you got right, and how many more than other people, 90% confidence.
Yeah, that could be an interesting thought. Any comment to this? Thanks.
To link a little bit to one of Diva's points, with the financial profits campaign or framing, I'm just trying to think what is it that they're rejecting? Is it that you're providing, they have a prior kind of about the distribution of outcomes for entrepreneurs or the kind of success rates, and you're kind of giving them some actual data, and they're saying, oh, well, that's not what I thought.
No, so we don't give them a number like this is how much you can earn. No, we just tell them, are you interested to become kind of rich? Do you want to run your own business to become successful? So this is along the line. So we don't give kind of any information of how much they would be able to earn. And we measure what they expect, but this could be confounded by the marketing theme that we're seeing. So we don't really have price because we don't have anything before they saw the marketing theme. And we see that those who saw the profit theme think they will earn more. So this is not a reflection probably of the prior, but kind of the prior worked and they think they can earn more when they become an entrepreneur. So we ask what are their expectations, but it's already after seeing the different marketing campaigns. Yeah, so that's unfortunately something we found. That's it. Good.
We can take some more questions.
I think we have a question. Okay, thanks so much.
I dropped something. I'm not quite sure what I dropped, but as long as everything's working. All right, so this is my third paper for the PhD, and I would value any feedback or comments that you have. I'm basically going to look at a corporate board quota reform in India in 2013 and look at effects of introducing a gender quota for boards on women as well as firm performance. So, as many of you know, India has one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world. It also has one of the lowest rates of women managers as well. So women comprised about 8% of management roles, 9% of business management roles, and only 2% of CEOs. Even in the sort of top 200 firms in India, only about 2% of directors were women in 2000, rising to about 5% in 2010. This, of course, changes a lot after the quote I discussed, but the sort of baseline scenario was low participation by women in corporate boards. These are also a tool. Gender quotas have been used on boards quite frequently in developed countries, high-income countries, and in a few other low-income countries like Kenya, South Africa, and Malaysia. So India introduced quotas in 2013 for all publicly listed firms, mandating that at least one woman on their company boards, one woman on the board was included, starting in 2014. The literature this contributes to is sort of a growing body of work on gender diversity in board membership and leadership, but a lot of this has been correlational and it's based in high-income countries, which face sort of a different set of constraints from developing countries. Mandating board quotas has been successful in increasing female representation and adding sort of more highly qualified and educated women, for example, in Norway and Italy and other places where this has been studied. There's, however, mixed evidence on the actual impact on firm performance from board diversity, and as I said, a lot of this is correlational. It's also associated with positive social and environmental impact, but more broadly, looking at the literature, causal evidence is limited, it's short-term, and it's inconclusive compared to political gender quotas, for example, where there's sort of a large consensus around effects So the main study questions are, does the quota actually succeed in improving gender diversity and female representation? How does it actually change the nature and structure of women's participation on boards? Does it change gender pay gaps for board membership? And what was the impact, finally, on firm performance, but also on personnel outcomes? This is, to my knowledge, the first paper looking at causal impact of board leadership for women in a developing country context. I used 2 private data sets. Thank you, CSAE, for funding access to Prime and Prowess, which basically give me listed firm data from 2006 to 2020 for what is a near universal sample of listed firms on the National Stock Exchange, and as well as board members, which includes a lot of details on board members, including their names, their gender, age, their education, tenure, and so on. And then on firm and financial performance as well. So this graph basically tries to capture the steep increase that follows with the introduction of the gender quota on board. So before the quotas were introduced, about 40% of women were actually of board members were women, and sort of within a period of 4 years, there's near universal compliance with the legal quota. Again, the proportion of women as well as part of boards actually increases significantly. Sorry, this was number of firms that had a woman on their board, and this is the proportion of women on board, which triples, more than triples actually, quadruples from 1 in 20 to 1 in 5. You see with the quota, sorry.
Clarification, if they have no women on the board, they include in this average?
Sorry, Simon, I can't hear you.
If a company has no women on the board, do you stick it in this graph as a 0, or does it not go in this graph?
So, in this one, it's a 0, so it basically just documents companies overall that have a woman on a board. This is just the overall proportion of women, on boards as a whole, so not company by company. But with the reform itself, there are basically more qualified and independent women who actually enter. So what might be, where is the clicker? There we go. So women are actually younger than men post-reform, and they're more likely to be independent. Now, independent means that they don't have a formal affiliation or a stake in the company or related to its ownership. So prior to the reform, women were actually more likely to be related to the corporate ownership, but unlike cases like Norway or other places where board quotas have been studied, the reform actually doesn't bring in more insiders, it brings in more independent women into the board structure. They're also likely to be less experienced than men, which is unsurprising given this influx of new women who are entering boards.
Quick question.
Sorry, go ahead.
It looks like from those numbers that they added women by increasing the size of boards. Is that correct?
Yes, they do. Yeah. So what basically happens is not only do the number of women go up, but also the number of men increases significantly as well. So some of the effect is diluted. So there are more women. I mean, they basically do increase the number of women beyond what is required by the law, but they do it by also increasing the board membership size on average. Sorry.
Is it correct to think that they're displacing independent men?
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because overall, it's surprising because you would have thought it would be more relatives or people who are, have some stake in the company who would be joining it. But they have these more independent women coming in and less independent. So they're getting more family men in, basically. So there seems to be something there, which honestly a lot more work needs to be done into analyzing the effects. Because I'm going to show you some results that I don't fully understand why we see what we see. And one of the things we do see is the quotas actually widen gender pay gaps in salary and remuneration. And I'm not entirely sure why this happens in terms of mechanisms, because even after controlling for characteristics, observable characteristics, you basically find that there is a divergence in salaries as well as remuneration by gender, which remuneration captures, other things like bonuses, sitting fees, so more than just your active salary. And it coincides with the introduction of the quota itself. Now, there are a few competing hypotheses. Women have less risk-taking, preferences, which may be showing up in the data, or that this pool of talent that is now available to tap into means that the sort of cost of board membership for women is going down. But sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to about the profile of women. I'm just wondering whether according to whether they're just close to the introduction. Whether close to the introduction of the quota, you see in the profile that the profile of women are a bit different at the end. Like it's sometimes they the countries in the quota they were spread around to find women to join the boards, and the women that joined right after the implementation of the policy were a bit different than the one that joined maybe 5 years later. It was the remuneration. So you said that's in the committee, so they still get the salary, but as corporate members, they should get some additional things for attending boards. Right? I don't know the name in English, sorry, but you get some when you are, how you say that. But yeah, it's not like a bonus, but you get some kind of, maybe that's that, maybe you negotiate that when they, or as well as men.
Yeah, so I do need to look at sort of changes in the kinds of women in more detail. I haven't been able to find that yet. No differences that are very obvious. But yeah, so the bonuses are included. So this remuneration does take into account other kinds of bonuses, but this divergence persists. It also persists after I add in controls for individuals, for firms, for sectors, and so on. And I find that while prior to the Companies Act, so the one that introduces the quotas, we don't actually see gaps being either large or existing at all. They certainly seem to emerge following the reform. And this is true for both salary as well as remuneration.
Could you go back one slide?
Sorry?
Could you go back one slide?
Yeah, this one?
Sorry, one more.
Yeah.
Actually, the graphs where you see the gender gap.
This one?
So is this only kind of salary or remuneration board members, female and male?
Yes, I don't have employees. So this is only board membership data for salaries and for remuneration. It would be interesting to actually see what that leads to in terms of firm level, staff and so on, but I don't know.
No, but actually, you were saying that you're surprised by the results.
Yeah.
But I have 2 ideas. So one is that they bring an independent woman, right?
Yeah.
To increase the number of women. So then maybe salary is all about tenure at the firm. And then women will have less tenure on average. To go down. And potentially, let's say among the men on the board, there were lots of disagreements about this policy, about this rule. Then maybe a way to calm them down was to increase their salary. Just speculation, but.
So I control for tenure and experience and other things in the regressions, but yes, I don't know what sort of do men start becoming pricier or the bargaining power of male board members I don't actually have data for. And it would be potentially interesting to do some mixed methods research to actually understand what happened. But I do see these pay gaps increase even after controlling for characteristics for the women. Then the next part is actually looking at what the impact of the reform is, both on the firm, so not on the women, but on the firm itself in terms of its economic and social performance, using an instrumental variable strategy based on Bertrand, Riddell, and Aarn and Dittmar, so something that they've established previously on pre-reform variation in female board representation, so sort of prior to the quota, to capture any exogenous variation that will happen in mandated changes in terms of the proportion of female board members. So I actually look at how does female board membership instrumented on there being a woman on the board prior to the reform influence outcomes such as total income, sales, value of assets, return on assets, but also personnel level outcomes, including staff welfare, training, and number of women employees. What I find is that using the instrument which is viable, having female members on your board does explain sort of higher income, sales, profits, as well as return on assets. These specifications hold, these results hold with alternate specifications, which I'll explain later. I also find positive impacts on budgets allocated to staff welfare, to staff training, as well as hiring and recruitment of employees. I don't, however, find any effects that are significant on the number of women employees. So the sort of effect passing down or the ripple effect to women is not something I am able to, I find sort of no effect, significant effect on that.
Could you just show again, so you can explain what is the instrument and what is the endogenous variable?
Yeah.
I think that's pretty good.
Sorry. So the instrumental variable here is having a woman on your board, which is what the sort of rule mandates. So do you have a woman on your board or not? And I instrumented on female board membership in 2013, so prior to the reform being introduced. So it's basically pre-reform variation in female board representation. So prior to the quota, not affected by the quota, to help explain sort of exogenous variation that has to follow following the law. Does that help? I do a bunch of robustness checks, including checking for pre-trends, impacts for years, if I limit the years to sort of not right after the quota, or I change specifications where instead of using whether there's a woman on the board or not, I look at proportion or share of women on the board, or follow sort of balanced sample analysis. To wrap up, the study basically is looking at both the compliance and implementation, as well as the impact of gender board quotas on pay gaps, on firm financial and social performance. It finds there's rapid compliance with the law over a few years, unlike other countries where it took a much longer period to get full compliance. There's also an influx of new, more qualified, educated women on the boards, but their participation, which I skipped over unfortunately, follows sort of gendered patterns. They're more likely to participate on committees like ethics committees or nomination and remuneration committees, rather than things like business development or management. Their participation leads to improved sales, income, profits, and return on assets. And there's more allocation towards staff training and welfare, as well as overall hiring. But there's no significant impact on women's employment. So I find sort of these mixed results from an empowerment or women's empowerment perspective. It's successful in bringing more women in, but it may not be such a useful tool to actually improve empowerment outcomes, either for the women board members in terms of their pay gaps, or for female employees in terms of recruitment of women at the firm level. So sort of weak mixed effects of quotas overall. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
So it's a pleasure to discuss this paper, and let me begin by denouncing what can only be described as an act of sabotage on the part of CSAE, who decided that I shouldn't get the paper until last night. When Diva, being smart enough to figure out this plot, decided to send it to me because it hadn't been uploaded on CSAE's website. Having said this, it was still a pleasure to read it, and I hope that my comments will make sense. And I'm more than happy to discuss this beyond today, and I think there's a lot of work that can come out of this that is super interesting. In fact, I will summarize my comments under one heading. This is a paper that screams mechanisms, where you really want to know what's going on, because the evidence, I think, is pretty interesting, it's pretty compelling. It's not obvious what you find. You find these widening gaps, and you immediately wonder what's going on. And there's only so much you can do, of course, with the data at your disposal. So I don't necessarily see this as an issue of limitations of the paper, but perhaps as opportunities for further work. Further work that can take also the form of experimental type work, behavioral experiments. I'd really like to know what's going on in a setting like this one, the moment that a reform like the one that you look at comes into play. To the extent possible, you can obviously look at some additional heterogeneity, and I hope some thoughts of this kind may help you in this respect. So, first of all, I would really want the paper to lay the ground a little bit more clearly about how we would expect, we would want these quotas in an ideal world to work. So you refer to the literature that exists. I think it would be nice to know how one can expect in a world where we would want these quotas to have a positive effect to do in practice. Because, of course, you can find a reduced form result that says they reduce gaps, but you still don't know what's going on. And one possibility, for instance, would be to think that one may correct misperceptions. That by getting people to experience what it is to have a colleague, a board member who is a woman, you essentially show them that women are as productive, if not more, than their male counterparts. So that, I think, could be a nice way of kind of setting the scene when the paper begins. And then comes the question of what do these quotas actually do? So what are they doing once you look at the results? And as you pointed out, and I'm not attempting to summarize the paper because I think it's crystal clear, you see some first stage results, you could call them like that. They do increase the amount of women on the boards. But then when it comes to seeing what they do to the performance of these women in this labor market, the effects are a little bit less intuitive, less mixed, less desirable, you could say, because if anything, pay gaps seem to increase, and it's not obvious that all the performance indicators that you look at when it comes to firms are improving. There is some improvement there, so I'm not negative in this respect. I'm just saying the evidence is probably less clear than it should be, or than one would wish it to be. And here come potential ideas for mechanisms. One, you've already mentioned, it is the classic selection story. So are we bringing in women who are, because they were doing something else before and they were not already in this market, on unobservable characteristics, because you do control for observable ones. So, I don't know if I want to call them less productive, but what you see is less paid for whatever reason. And could it be just a selection story? Could it be instead an active, and by the way, before I get to the final point, the selection story, to some extent, hinges on one piece of information that is quite important to your story, and where I'd like to see a little bit more in terms of describing it, which is the information about the motivation for hiring these women. To some extent, I have the feeling that this is self-reported information, so presumably there are shades of gray when it comes to how connected are you to this firm. And I'm not questioning the validity of the data. I would probably just want you to describe it in a little bit more detail in the paper, because it can help getting a sense of how reliable that piece of information is. And then finally, where I think it gets really interesting, is what's going on if it's not just selection. What's going on in terms of potential counteracting forces, like the ones that you described. Maybe there is bargaining power that for some reason goes down for the firms that come into play, and it's because men feel threatened. Maybe it's because men feel like they need to be compensated. And I don't know if there is something you can do in this respect. Perhaps yes, perhaps no, but I would definitely welcome, at least a little bit more of a description of these kinds of mechanisms in the paper. At the stage where the paper is, I think it can be very useful and it can open alleys for further investigation later on. I'll leave it to that. I'm more than happy to discuss further, and well, it was a pleasure to read the paper.
Helpful comments. Super helpful comments. Yeah. So just to very quickly respond, I think this is exactly the kind of stuff I do need to do. So these are all helpful. I think I talk a little bit about the selection, but I do need to expand on that part. The information and reasons for being hired, I don't have a lot on that. But what I do have is, as I said, data from the firms, which I believe at least is valid. I believe it's accurate because they're supposed to be reported based on the law. So I don't think they'd be lying just sort of different penalties around reporting. Having said that, it is the Indian government, so it's not entirely certain that it is 100% accurate. But anyway, I think the data is reliable, but I do need to look a little bit more into what that selection story could be, or the mechanisms are, and I think that's exactly on point in terms of next steps. So, thanks for the feedback.
I can just follow up very quickly on that. Even if you don't have information on how reliable the data is, if you could say something along the lines of what you just said, which is that you don't have strong reasons to believe that there would be incentives to misreport, because you see, what I had in mind is something that I vaguely termed social desirability, which is probably not the kind of term in this respect, but say that firms have this perception that they would be wanted not to report, that these firms have hired, that they have hired, women that are connected. It's probably the kind of thing that it's easy to misreport if they want to, but if there's no reason to, and you're really far away from suspecting that this may be the case, it could help your story.
Oh, thanks.
So one other story that I think explains the gap is that there's lower match surplus for women because the firms don't care about a particular woman, they just need all women, whereas they care about a particular men. And I think you can test that by looking for greater turnover among women board members than men board members. Like, they don't want to pay them because they don't care if they stay or not. That'll give you a good.
It's a good hypothesis to test, yeah.
It could also just be negotiation, like if there's a loophole with term, like we're negotiating less. But, I guess it depends where you want to go with it, but I think there's the organizational literature which talks a lot about, beyond econ literature, about who's on boards and things like that. And one interesting area is, like, if you look at CSR spending,
I don't have data on that.
You don't have anything, but if these are publicly reported, they would have something on that.
It's I'm not saying they don't have it publicly reported in their reports. I just don't have it in this data set. So could I scrape it eventually from all the firm reports? I probably could, but.
And then is there heterogeneity by industry?
Sorry?
Is there any heterogeneity by industry?
Yes, that's what I have to do next, because there are actually effects in terms of employment based on sort of.
And if the gaps are different also by,
that is the communication. Sorry, Kristina.
Yes, I'm wondering, it seems like the numerations, the gap grows wider, so how much they can, the performance pays for men and women differ in what, when you also see this kind of increases in firm performance, so the man's remuneration also, like the salaries are more tied to the kind of firm performance, they have the natural, like when the women have to just like have a flat payment, then they are less participating in that. It doesn't explain it in the beginning, but how it would evolve over time, so anything on the payment structure?
That's the thing, I don't actually have the payment structure. I just have like the overall payout rather than what the structure of the contract is.
You could relate it to kind of changes in firm performance and then maybe tease that out a little bit. If men react to these changes in male salaries react to that and females
more than the women, so there is something that's interesting. Yeah. These are great ideas, people. Coming. So let someone learn.
I have one question. So I was just a bit confused confused about the control group, right? So if there's a quota, then every firm should have at least one woman on the board, right? So then, if you instrument the female dummy with something, then the female dummy should be one for every firm, right?
I think it's based on the fact that before the reform, a number of firms didn't actually have one. Okay? So you're considering it based on pre-reform duration. The logic being that after the reform, like either they have one or they don't have to actually add a woman to their board.
Then so after the quota, you're comparing performance of firms that already had females on board before, compared to firms that did not have females or women on the board before. That's kind of
yeah, and so you look at pre-trends and so on as well to make sure that they're comparable. There's also an argument that happened before, right? Before reform, then those decisions may actually get back. Like, let's say a year or two after, so I also do those specifications longer term plans. But I'm basically just following sort of a thread that we're trying to identify views and following new projects. Is there one more question here? Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thank you for making it to the last act of the day. I'm very much aware of the fact that I'm standing in human rigs, which is a statement that has a lot more value once the conference is in person, I realize. So I better be careful with my timekeeping, but I do promise that this is going to be a very straightforward presentation. It's a very straightforward paper with a very straightforward question. You see pretty straightforward results. Let me call it like that. You'll see what I mean. It's joint work with Martin Chiguer, who is in Dar es Salaam, University of Dar es Salaam, and Andreas Menzel in Prague. I'm Paolo Falco. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Copenhagen. This paper is about the relationship between being connected to your boss and your choice of effort on the job. It's basically as straightforward as that. We are trying to test whether being connected to your employer by kin, family, friendship relationships has an impact on the effort you exert on the job. And we're trying to do that experiment. We start from simple observations, which I'm sure have been on your mind in some way or another as you were thinking about issues to do with developing economics. First of all, we know that not only in developing countries, but throughout the world, many workers find jobs through social networks. So there is a lot of working for your family in this world. There's a lot of working for your friends. And at the same time, there is a pretty strong literature that shows that broadly speaking, nepotism and family connections, when they intermingle with the firm, they don't typically lead to better productivity and better outcomes. I come from a place where some of that work has been staged. You know, Italy is famous for having a place of a lot of family firms, and it's not a place that is famous for high productivity. Just to give you an example, in the developing world, the same has been found. But it's far from obvious, because on the one hand, you may have this channel of I am working for my family, therefore I feel entitled, and I'm not going to put a lot of effort into it. On the other hand, there may be the screening channel, the monitoring channel. I may be solving some principal-agent problems by being connected to the worker, and that should lead to higher productivity in certain settings. In fact, let me clarify a little bit more what are the specific channels that we have in mind here, and what is the one that we will be testing in more specific detail. Hiring through social networks, if one takes the starting observation that nepotistic firms have been found, and by the way, public sector institutions have been found to be less productive, may happen, this negative impact on productivity may happen for at least two reasons. One is a selection story. I am tapping into a pool of talent that is more limited, inevitably, if I am just looking at my family and friends, and therefore I am going to be relying on lower skills, on less talent in my firm. The other one is conditional on whomever I hire. That person, because they're working for me as opposed to a stranger, they're related to me and they feel like I am not going to be sacking them in the moment that they do something wrong because I'm their dad, their mother, their friend, and so on. They may be exerting lower effort. This is our initial observation. This is our initial starting point. And we want to test this in practice. We do this with an experiment. The simplest experiment you can think about. A clean experiment that aims at testing the effort channel in particular. So in fact, I should be saying we're not going to be testing both of these. We're going to be focusing on the second one, the effort channel, given selection. And in order to do this, we need a clean experiment that allows us to isolate the second channel. How do we do it? We create a job, and we randomly allocate workers to either work with someone they know or to work with a complete stranger. We have a direct measure of productivity because the job allows us to measure precisely how much effort they exert, because it's the kind of task that has a very direct mapping, you see, from effort to performance. There's basically no skills involved. It's literally about how much effort and attention you want to dedicate to the thing that you're doing, which is a costly, boring task. So in that respect, there's this direct mapping. And we can also test a little bit in terms of mechanisms that may be driving whatever we see. In particular, at some point, we're going to be testing whether the channel of effort may be, in fact, a channel that has to do either with the fear of being punished the moment that you do not put effort, or alternatively, a form of generosity and altruism vis-a-vis your employer, which may be higher if it's towards a family or a friend or family member of a friend. That is the, so to speak, polar opposite, at least in the simple representation of mechanisms that may be applied. What we find in this very simple setup is, in fact, that connected workers, contrary to the hypothesis that we started from, do not exert lower, nor in fact higher effort than non-connected workers. And we can say that with a pretty strong degree of precision. We are very well powered. Minimal detectable effects here of 2.3%. So whatever is economically meaningful in this respect, we would pick up. And you will see that we will be looking at differences between these groups that are strikingly small. So the control and the treatment group, differentiated by connection versus non-connection with their employer, seem to be doing pretty much exactly the same. And we'll have plenty of time to discuss this. Finally, perhaps unsurprisingly, given that I told you that there isn't a big difference, there also doesn't seem to be much of a role for the fear of punishment channel versus altruism. I'll show you how we do this, but essentially, once we shut down the potential for reprisal, for punishment, I'll tell you how, there is also no change. How do we contribute to this literature? Well, we contribute, we think, to a couple of strands of the literature. First of all, the obvious question of social ties and effort choice is one that has attracted the attention of other studies. Not all of them are experimental, and even the experimental work has not really focused on the type of social ties that we are focusing on and we believe they're relevant. I'm referring to the work by Palais and Sands. Fascinating paper, but what they do there is they focus on the relationship among workers. So they essentially look at how much effort workers exert the moment that they know that the moment that they vary the extent to which the fact that they've been referred by another worker matters in the context. So they make that more or less salient, more or less important, but they look at the effect of being referred by another worker within your working context on your probability of exerting an effort, which is a form of peer pressure, if you see what I mean. What we're interested in is what we think is the more fundamental question in this context of if I'm hired by my dad and my mom, which is what we think about very often as family firms, or my friend, but if my friend, mom or dad are my employer, not my peer, what am I going to do when it comes to effort? And that's what essentially differentiates us from what's out there already. And then a broader literature on nepotism, family connections, broadly speaking, and efficiency, that tells us why firms may be hiring through social networks in the first place. We contribute to that because one may hypothesize in the space that perhaps one could even expect higher effort from connected workers if what you're doing in this space, I mentioned it earlier, is solve some principal agent problem. In a world of limited enforceability of contracts, imperfect contracts, the developing world is very often a case like that. Having someone that you know may be like a form of screening that the market does not allow you to do and may allow you to solve monitoring, screening problems that play principal agent type of dynamics that may lead to higher effort. We don't find the difference, so in a sense we dispel this opportunity, this idea too, but obviously this would require additional work. Now, let me tell you what we do, and I will be quite brief in the interest of time. First of all, a little bit on our experimental design. We do this in Dar es Salaam, capital city of Tanzania, as you will know, I'm sure. And what we do is we invite small business owners to, and by the way, yes, Dar es Salaam is not the capital city. It's the biggest city in Tanzania, but not the capital city. Pardon me on that. Small business owners from Dar es Salaam are invited to the capital city, by the way, is Dodoma, if I'm not mistaken, which is one of these modern capital cities of the world that have been created at some point by the government. Thank you, Simon. Small business owners from Dar es Salaam are invited to this session. And by one session, I actually mean 10 sessions of about 30 employers and workers for every session. So the way it works is the following. There's going to be small business owners that are invited to the experiment. Each one of them is asked to bring along a person who either works for them already or may work for them if a chance arises. So the wording of the invitation was something along the lines of, think about a person that either works for you or you can trust with your business, so that you could entrust your business to if the need arises. So if you have to leave your business for a day and you want to hire this person to do your job, or you simply want to hire for the business like any other employee, and bring them along to the experiment. One half of the pairs are kept as they arrive at the session, and they play the game jointly. One other half are severed and reshuffled, in the sense that the employer and the employee do not go through the experiment together, but instead we find a new match for them, which results in half of the sample going through the experiment with someone they know, and the other half being reshuffled so that they're actually paired with a switch. What do they actually have to do in practice? Well, pretty much everybody gets people to do these days in the field when it comes to real effort tasks, which is sorting beans, which are given to them in a bag that is mixed with 3 different kinds of beans into 3 separate batches that we weigh. the more beans of a correct color you sort, the more money you make. This is one of the experimental sessions. You can see every respondent is separated from someone else by a wooden box that makes the performance of that person not visible to everybody else. This limits peer effects, this limits, issues to do with even to some extent, social desirability, observability. We don't want to give respondents the feeling that they're constantly being watched by some observer, by some experimenter who is looking over their shoulder. The more beans they sort, the more money they make, and the way this works out in practice is that they have to do this for 8 minutes. For every gram that they sort, they get 2 Tanzanian shillings, plus 700 shillings, which is an amount that they get no matter the performance. And let me just give you one more piece of information. On average, they sort about 350 grams worth of beans, which means that they get 700 plus 700 on average from the performance that they show.
Yes, let's suppose that you are invited to do the job, and then you are asked to bring somebody you know, and then you bring me back. And then I come there with you, and then we are actually supposed to work together.
Yes.
Then to what extent do I actually feel like you're my employer or my boss in this game? Because that's where you started the motivation. So
what we tell you from the beginning throughout the game is that this is a game where you're going to be paid for doing a job. You're doing a job for someone else, and that someone else is going to get 4 Tanzanian shillings for every gram of correctly sorted beans that you're going to be sorted. That's the instruction. So this is obviously a lab job. It's a job that exists in the context of a lab, and it's there with all the due limitations. But it replicates the dynamic of a real setup where you have someone that is there, figuring as your employer. They're going to make a profit off of your work, and depending on how much you work, their profit is going to be increased. The task is performed twice by every worker. First, they perform it without an employer. In fact, they're just told, here's a task, do it in 8 minutes on your own. There's no story about the employer first. You're going to get 2 shillings for every gram of correctly sorted beans you have. And we call that the practice gram, just so we can get a baseline measure of productivity that we're going to throw into the regressions. They then do it again, and the second time, they know that they're going to have an employer, just like I described. And in this case, the employer gets 4 shillings for every 2 shillings that they get. The reason for the 4 shillings versus 2 shillings, knowing that on average knowing the average, is that this basically equates the total payoff on average for the 2. So there is no big issue of the employee feeling like that they're getting the weaker end of the bargain here, that the employer is making a lot more than them, because that can trigger issues to do with the inequality aversion and issues of that kind that we try to control for to the extent possible. So we wanted that on average, employer and employees get the same. And then finally, a random subset of players, they are assigned to a treatment where we conceal the identity of the worker from the employer. This is the treatment where no punishment is possible, because if the employer doesn't know who the employee is, we can exclude that they're going to be doing anything as a reprisal for poor performance. In this context, whatever we see the employees do is going to be an act of what we call altruism. You could call it other regarding preferences. You could call it unincentivized, motivation, whatever you want to call it. It's something that cannot come because you're worried that the employer otherwise will be annoyed. Very, very quickly on sample and descriptives, we just went around Dar es Salaam, a random walk process. Every X households, we picked one. We got one person from the household, provided that they were a business owner, and we continued until we got 320 that accepted the invitation, 313 attended. On average, the employers are 59% female, 40 years old on average, and 8.5 years old. They have 8.5 years of education. The workers are a little bit younger. They're still 60% female, and they're very similar levels of education. Let me now give you the results. First of all, I want to show you this histogram, which tells you that there is a significant amount of variation in the output that workers can produce in these 8 minutes. I told you that on average it's about 350 grams of correctly sorted beans, but what we see here is that it goes from 200 to 500, and the reason that I put it up here is that if one was worried about something that is clearly central to this story, potentially, a central concern, that this all comes from demand effects, experimental demand effects. I put you to do a bean sorting task. All you're going to do is sorting beans. There's nothing else you can do, and of course you're not going to see any effect of being connected or unconnected. Well, yes, but if that was really what was going on, and the only thing that was going on, I would imagine seeing such a big spread. It does seem that people do care more or less about this task. They're going to put more or less effort into this task. And there is a meaningful sense in which this task can lead to variation in the output that we hope may be affected, or we hypothesize may be affected by the connection or the lack of a connection. Having said that, let me give you the gist of the results. Essentially, being connected to an entrepreneur leads to no significant effect on workers' performance. The way you see this is by looking at, let's begin from these first 2 results, the second differing from the first by the fact that we control for baseline productivity. The units here are grams sorted out of 350 grams on average. You can see immediately that by looking at the effects, 2 grams and 6 grams are nothing in terms of, impacts. I don't need to, tell you that these are a few percentage points, far less than what we care about. And if we did have effects that we cared about, they would be detectable. This is basically a 0, which we think dispels the hypothesis we begin from, which is that there may be a differential productivity between these workers and workers that are not connected. Between workers that are connected and not connected. We test whether things are different when, instead of just asking the question of how do people that were brought by the employer for any type of self-reported connection that they might have compared to non-connected workers, instead of doing that, we move to, let's actually check who is connected by a family or friendship tie. So we actually check what we mean by connected, and in that case also, it doesn't seem to be doing anything. There isn't much heterogeneity by gender. And in addition to just looking at the composition of the pairs, being female, female, male, male, female, male, male, female, we also do one additional exercise, which is essentially we confine the sample to instances in which, after reshuffling the pairs randomly, we obtain a combination which is the same as the original combination that the people came with. So if someone came male-male, employer-worker, and we just look at the reshuffling, we're going to be comparing them and everybody else to the entire mass of people after the reshuffling takes place. You could argue that there may be biases there because the pairs are not representative of because the matches are exogenous. So what you want to do, the best you can do in this respect, is essentially for every pair that you've reshuffled, among all the pairs that you've reshuffled, drop those that end up in a reshuffled combination that is different from the original one they came with. So if they came male-male, and after reshuffling they end up male-female, we drop them from the sample, and we only keep them if they were male-male after the reshuffling. And so we end up with a lower sample that should deal with this kind of potential difference in comparability, but still it doesn't do very much. So very long ramble for not doing a lot ultimately with these results. Finally, if we also look at whether column 6 looks at the potential effect of the treatment where we conceal the identity of the worker from the employer, and that too does not change the story. Couple of extensions. We look at whether workers who are connected have perhaps the same average, but when it comes to deviations from the average that they could be predicted to have, they may be more uncertain in their output. This is, non-connected workers. Say that the worker, by virtue of not being connected, seems riskier to the employer because maybe the average is the same, but their volatility in output is less predictable. When we use a little model to predict your average earnings and then look at the deviations from that, it doesn't seem to be the case that unconnected workers are less consistent, further away from this average than connected workers. So it does not seem to be an issue of volatility. And finally, there's very little heterogeneity by the income of the entrepreneur as well. So we just simply look at whether the entrepreneur is richer or less rich, and we may be interested in seeing whether that has differential impacts on how workers react to working with a connected worker versus a connected entrepreneur versus an unconnected one, and that does not seem to be the case. So, concluding, we run an experiment to test the impact of social connections on workers' effort. We're powered to detect meaningful economic impacts, anything that is above 2%, which we think is a good definition of meaningful. We do not find that connected workers exert lower or higher effort. In fact, the performance of these workers is surprisingly similar to the performance of unconnected workers. And we do not find evidence that punishing workers or leaving open the channel of potential punishment of workers open leads to difference of results. When we shut down the channel and we don't allow employers to know the identity of the worker, and therefore we remove the possibility there could be reprisal, the results remain the same. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed reading the paper. It was very clear and concise. And, I think it's a very interesting topic, so I'm not really summarizing that here. But I would like to state what's to like, and there are many things to like. I think it's addressing a really important question, and a lot of work has been focused on the kind of selection. And now you want to look at what's kind of the efforts associated with connections, and I think it's a nice contribution that you make to the literature. I also like that it's a very simple and straightforward design, so that's very beautiful that you really only focus on the kind of the effort channel, and you have this real effort task, you have social connectedness, and what you also do a very nice job in is that you kind of try to quantify the null effect that you essentially find and try to rule out other explanations, and so that's all to like. There are a couple of things that I think that kind of you can improve a little bit upon. And the first one is really, you showed it in column 3, I think, where you look at those who actually have connections to each other. So essentially you ask the employers to bring somebody they work with or they would want to work with, and only a subset of them, around 2/3, actually report that they have family or friendship ties with them. So in your motivation, I think this is the sample that you would want to look at, because the others do have a connection, but it seems to be a purely working relation. So essentially, you have already a pre-selected sample, and to understand a bit more of what are the existing selections happening from the employer and the worker, and whom are the employers asking to join them, would be important. And then if you want to limit your sample to the kind of part that you care about, those who have actually family and friendship ties, then you should also show that your sample is really balanced on this, because it's nicely balanced on the overall sample, but you do have a selection here. And so I think it would be nice to stress that point further and to show that this reduction doesn't really harm you in terms of reassigning the workers and the employees. Okay, and then I'm not really sure why the workers should care about like kind of their employees' benefit. And so you stressed a bit this kind of altruism channel, but in a way, like kind of the workers work and the employer gets benefit. And if I think about how that relationship is in reality, then there is something that the employer puts into that. So it may be capital or investment and maybe risk that the employer is taking. And therefore the worker might find it more like kind of plausible that they also get like kind of a profit of their work. So essentially here it's only a free riding exercise where the employer gets a benefit and the worker is working, no? So essentially if you want to see like kind of a positive benefit with respect to effort provision, then it can be purely driven by the worker caring so much about the employer's benefit that they would exert more effort, right? So on the one hand, I was thinking whether you can really, or whether it's possible for you to predict what would be an optimal level of effort for each worker, and that of course depends on the costs of sorting beans. But if you were to have this kind of what's an optimal level of effort that a worker is providing, then you could also kind of think like, are you already like kind of, is your incentive structure in such a way that there is no scope for this altruism, because the incentives for the workers are already quite high. And so when they are given that they have a certain cost of effort, are already maxing it out and are already at their optimum, they will not be able to provide more effort given their cost, even if they were to care about the employer. So they're kind of thinking a bit about that theoretically. Of course, you don't have these kind of costs of effort, no? It probably depends on abilities or how, but maybe you could play a little bit around with that with like kind of assuming different levels of effort, or like showing these kind of two utility functions, one where you actually include some increases in utility, given that your employer is also having a benefit, a material benefit of that, and one without, and then seeing how the effort costs would need to differ in order to actually be able to see that picking up in the data. So essentially how good are your incentives? Are your incentives already so strong that you can't max out on the effort that you are providing, given your costs of providing that effort? And then you could also think about, you talked a bit about inequality aversion, no? So essentially the final payment, workers would need to be able to calculate what would be a different income between them and their kind of employee, even though you kind of calibrated it nicely and it's working out, that on average it should be the same. No, but maybe you could think of either looking into this kind of inequality aversion on the final output, but also then on the marginal payment. It doesn't seem to really affect that, but maybe you can have a toy model to kind of try to dig a bit deeper into these things. And this is a bit related to this last point that you stressed, like kind of, do you have altruism or fear of retaliation? So if you can only, like, how would like kind of employees retaliate against the worker? On the one hand, you would need to have evidence that your worker is slacking on you. So they have to provide less effort than you think what they should. And for that you need a sense of what would be an optimal level of effort that you were to expect, and only if the worker falls short of that you would retaliate. And for that it would be nice to have some idea of what the employers would expect the workers to provide, to actually see, do they have a reason to retaliate? And then this retaliation, what form would it have? Even if the identity was clear. So if they only have a working relationship, they may not have any possibility to retaliate, but if they have like kind of the social connection with family and friends, they may have more scope, like kind of to exercise peer punishment, or to have the dimension differently from their work relation in which they kind of retaliate. So maybe you can also look into this further. Other ones are too detailed to present here. So thanks so much. I enjoyed reading the paper.
Thank you very much, Kristina. Maybe I'll get back to your, I'll reply to your points quickly and give some thoughts, and then I can take a few more questions if there are any. So first of all, on the issue of who is actually connected and not, that's absolutely well taken. So to some extent, we wanted to make this a little bit more general than having to pick who is who, because the moment that you start confining it to connections, you got to define those connections. And then is a friend, a cousin, a second degree cousin, where do you stop? So we had to kind of go with a more general sense, and the general sense was someone you know. Someone you know, and you have some kind of relationship with. Having said that, we can totally look into further detail on that. Of course, balance and, I actually don't know, in terms of balance, I don't know that we've checked. There's no sense that it shouldn't be. I mean, I presume it is, but of course we can double check that. But more than balance, I guess issues of sample size will obviously come into play. And this being a case of the result being, the lack of a result, then you could say, okay, but, it's not going to jeopardize any major conclusion except for the issue of power. Because the moment that you then become underpowered to detect things that could be economically meaningful, the story becomes obviously a little bit weaker. There's also the issue of clustering, of course, in the background. I realized that, during the session, I spoke about 10 sessions. It's actually 32 sessions of 10 employees in each. Somehow this 10 number keeps coming up in all sorts of experiments. I have to remember which is which, but 32 sessions still give us a bit of ability to cluster at the session level, but once you start going into the nitty-gritty, obviously things become a little bit more complicated, but of course the point is absolutely well taken. I very much like also the idea that one can do something to try and predict what employers... I mean, first of all, next time I do this, if we do get a chance of doing it again or expanding this further, I'd like to know a little bit more about employers' expectations. So actually ask them what they predict that the outcome is going to be, precisely to see to what extent we can check whether they fall short, the employees, of some kind of threshold. And but otherwise, the idea of, generally speaking, predicting some kind of outcome and figuring out how far you are from that outcome could actually inform the sense to which there could be any meaningful punishment, there could be any meaningful expectation that they're falling short of some kind of predetermined level of productivity, and interestingly also that there may be some aversion to the employer getting a lot more than the employee does, because at that point the employee, you could argue, also has a better sense of how much they could be expected to produce on average, and therefore how much they will make vis-a-vis the employer and so on. But absolutely, these are all excellent points, and we'll definitely think about them. Thank you. Yes, please.
So following up her comment about kind of maybe the workers are really maxing out effort, so whether or not you're connected doesn't matter, because even if you want, you cannot really do more, right? So how about if you did this again, how about a treatment where the worker basically gets the same payoff, no matter how many beats he or she collects? Right, so then I would expect that, if you're randomly shuffled to somebody you don't know, then you just don't do anything, because you just pick up this 2 shilling that you get anyway, no matter what. But then if you work for the pair that you came with, then maybe you exert more effort, because then the connection kind of comes into play. Because then you kind of isolate your own benefit, right? You see what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. If you want to go back.
Yeah.
I mean, also mirrors more what happens in reality, right? Because in reality, as a worker, maybe you get a fixed salary, and then yeah.
Yes, I see what you mean. I mean, the question would be, yes, I mean, of course, it could be definitely something that one could experiment with, going further and trying to tease out in greater detail. Certainly. I mean, my general sense is that this is obviously something that can go further than where it is now, in terms of, it's easy to replicate, and it's easy to try and see whether the variation that you may or may not be seeing in this context would be triggered by a slight variation in the setup, which is super simple to generate. But yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, so you showed the distribution of beans in the second round. So I was wondering if the distribution was tighter in the first round, and whether, I guess they don't know how many beans they put in, but they know that 350 is the break-even point. So they don't know exactly how much grams, so maybe there's a sense of fairness, more people are stopping there. And I don't know if you wanted to look at particular people who are related, family related, if they're who's putting in less effort in the second round relative to the first round.
That's a good point. I don't know that we have that graphic But we can definitely look at it, and we can also definitely investigate whether once you have made a better or worse performance in the first round, it's already in the background of this. At the moment, we're only using it as a control. So I can't tell you off the top of my head, but it's definitely something we can check. Certainly. Yeah.
I'm curious if you added third worker, see the impact that would have on the first worker's productivity. If you do the employer and the first worker that have a social tie or a family tie, and then you bring in an employee that has no tie, how that might impact. There's a slacking type of relationship or something. How that
Sorry, can you say it again? So we have first
you go with the employer and the first worker that have a social tie. And the second time you bring in a third worker who has no tie.
Right.
It's sort of indicative of like a family business as it grows. You're having, let's say, the parents of the child, and then you bring in more and more unrelated employees. Does that have an effect on the productivity of the child?
Yeah. I mean, of course, it becomes a more complex game, but absolutely. I mean, it could be an additional channel that one can experiment with. Certainly. Agreed. I mean, I don't know how that would play out, because you can see all sorts of reasons why it could go in different directions, right? On the one hand, you feel like there's a free riding problem. There's already someone else who's in the firm. Is that person connected versus not connected? Is the second child in the firm going to slack off more because there is a first child who is already taking the brunt and, in a sense, compensating for their free riding? Or is there going to be peer pressure? And in that case, there's going to be something that goes in the other direction. But yes, I mean, I guess ultimately the answer would be an empirical one. Thank you. Yeah?
So just a very minor technical question. So you mentioned a couple of times the power. Is this like an ex post power calculation, or like ex ante, like pre-registered?
This was pre-registered.
The power, the one that you were...
Now, I mean, I will have to... Whether we actually pre-registered the power calculations, I don't remember, but we definitely calculated the power beforehand.
Because I'm sure it's not going to be different, but I would just make sure.
Sure.
Before the ex-ante one, given that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Can I just ask, so did they play the game twice per week? Do you think that the differences there would be difference in outcomes if you allow them to play no longer, not repeatedly, when they have to actually earn the right to continue, but 3 weeks sort of like you can get fired or I'm just...
So if they could play it once again afterwards, or...
I mean, if you would allow multiple...
Uh-huh.
And actually condition as well, whether they're selected for the next round by the employer, and building this that in the employment, right? I mean, you basically try to care about this, also if you still want to lose your job, which could be more predominant among non-social ties. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, this is part of the sort of broader set of points about expanding this into additional context. This speaks to me as the moment that you're going to put some kind of, you could call it an element of reputation in this, and an element of, punishment based on an expectation that you have created relative to an expectation that you created based on a previous performance. How does this play out? It obviously doesn't go up to that point because we don't have enough rounds to be doing this. And more simply, one could also think about whether whatever kind of effort effect, which we don't see, however, in this respect, depletes over time. That's another possibility. Depletes over time, knowing that effort may become more or less costly. You obviously need to think about what the channels at play could be. You can, the cost of effort may be non-linear, and similarly, there may be punishment that is non-linear, and it obviously goes into all sorts of different directions, and one should think about in advance. But the point is certainly well taken. Great. So if there are no further questions, which I don't see, thank you so much. This was the end of the session. Thank you.